America. A beautiful land. A continent full of contrasts. Towering mountains and fertile prairies. Dense rainforests and rocky deserts. From all over the earth, people have come to this land. Different kinds of people coming for many different reasons, bringing their languages and customs, their skills and beliefs. Upon this land, many different cultures have met. Asian, African, European, Native American. Sometimes we have fought. Sometimes we have mingled. But in the encounters between cultures, a new society has been created. A society always changing, always redefining itself. For in many ways, what it means to be an American reflects the ever-changing mix of cultures and ideas that make up the American story. So who were the peoples that created today's America? Where did they come from? How did they live? 500 years ago, Europeans and Africans first met the native people of the Americas, beginning an exchange and interaction that would reshape the history of the world. Native Americans have many mythological stories about their origins. Some say the first people descended from homes in the sky. Others say they came up from other worlds beneath ours. But all of the stories establish a close connection between the land, the people, and other living things.
It's very important to live in relationship and harmony with the earth, with Mother Earth. In Apache, we use that word in our prayers, Nigusan Shema, which means Mother Earth.
From Mother Earth comes life. They consider their mountains sacred, and they consider their rivers sacred. They pay tribute to Mother Nature. They say, thank you for giving me the bounties of the earth.
Archaeologists believe that people first came to the Americas from northern Asia at least 20,000 years ago. The level of the world's oceans was lower then, and a land bridge connected Siberia and Alaska. Hunters following herds of bison, caribou, and mammoths crossed into North America. As people spread south over the two continents, these Stone Age hunter-gatherers encountered forests, deserts, mountains, and prairies. They adapted to each environment, creating many different cultures. No one knows for sure how many people lived in the Americas. Historians estimate that by the 15th century, there were anywhere from 20 million to as many as 100 million people. Numbers close to, or perhaps even greater than, the population of Europe. Hundreds of distinct Native American societies spoke at least 1,000 different languages. Most societies were ruled by men, but in many Native American societies, women held considerable power, and women chiefs were not uncommon.
In the traditional longhouse, the clan mothers, who were made up of the oldest mothers in the longhouse, were essentially the ruling body. And it was up to the clan mothers to decide who the chiefs would be. Even today, the women have the power and the authority to let their voices be heard. And they should be heard and listened to, adhered to.
Many Native societies were matriarchal. Family lineage was traced through women who also controlled personal property. There's a lot we don't know about Native American life before the 1500s. Few Native Americans left written records, and evidence about their lives has been lost or destroyed. Most of what we do know comes from archaeological evidence, from the oral traditions of modern Native Americans, and from the accounts of early European visitors to the Americas. We know that the heavily populated agricultural empires of Central and South America were technologically sophisticated and highly organized. In the central prairies and eastern woodlands of North America, tribes of hunter-gatherers lived off the bounty of the land. Men hunted and fished, while women grew a variety of crops. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples lived in cliffside villages, easily defended against attack. They grew cotton to spin cloth, and enough squash, beans, and corn to feed communities of 1,000 or more people. In the colder climes, where the growing seasons were too short for agriculture, Inuits, Eskimos, and other northern tribes relied on fish and game. Although their societies were very different, Native Americans shared many common beliefs and attitudes. Most Native Americans didn't have any concept of owning the land. Instead, they saw all of their relationships with other people and with the earth itself as reciprocal and mutually dependent.
Great Spirit made this good land, gave it to all of us to enjoy it in common. And no one man should claim, this is my land. We don't do that, they say.
It would be like trying to own a block of air. How do you do that? You know, it was a completely foreign concept. And it was a concept that was thrust upon us and created many problems for us.
Many Native Americans still believe that there is a spirit force in all things, in water, trees, and animals, as well as people. They didn't seek to rule their environment. They tried to fit into the natural order of creation. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the geography and peoples of West Africa were equally diverse. Below the Great Sahara, open grasslands and tropical rainforests spread out across the continent. On the southern edge of the Sahara were the nomadic Tuareg traders. Cattle and goat herders roamed the grasslands of sub-Saharan Africa. In the rainforests of southern equatorial Africa, the Bakongo Empire numbered in the millions.
Neither Native Americans nor Africans saw themselves as being superior to or ready to dominate the natural world. The natural world was a teammate rather than something to be subdued.
Men and women among the peoples of Lower Guinea each handled their own affairs, each governing over members of their own sex.
There are examples from West African history where women holding significant political power. Leaps to mind here be the Mali Empire, the Asante Federation, or the Dahomey people who are located along the Guinea coast near the mouth of the Niger River. In each of these places, women either exercised direct political control over their states or served, for example, in the military of the Dahomey people.
But life in West Africa was different in many ways from life in the Americas. Not only did West Africans have different crops and domesticated animals, they also lived in a world plagued by yellow fever, malaria, sleeping sickness, and other deadly diseases. Africans had for centuries followed earth-based religions, worshiping the spirits in the natural world around them. But beginning in the 9th century, a new religion appeared in West Africa, Islam.
Islam spread in its earliest years by war along the North African coast, but merchants brought it across the Sahara Desert in the process of their normal trading business, which took them to the large cities of the Sahel. Right? As a result, city dwellers in the Sahel were the first people to convert to Islam in West Africa.
In the year 1325, Mansa Musa, the Muslim king of Mali, stopped in Cairo on his pilgrimage to Mecca.
He set off in a caravan of his people, about 500 or 600 people, and walked right across the Sahara, carrying tons and tons of gold.
Mansa Musa gave away so much gold on this one trip that he collapsed the price of gold in Europe as well as North Africa. Stories of Mali's immense wealth spread throughout the Muslim world and Europe. The Muslim Empire of Mali grew rich from its control of the West African trade routes. trading made the kingdoms of the West African savanna rich and powerful. From the forest peoples to the south, they obtained gold, ivory, cola nuts, and slaves. From the north came salt, cloth, tools, horses, and weapons from North Africa and Europe.
The trans-Saharan trade created an enormous amount of wealth that led to the foundation of several large cities in the Sahel, the most famous of which is Timbuktu, which by the 15th century possessed the Sangori Mosque, which was famous throughout the Muslim world, as well as a university, and was certainly known to Muslim merchants as the source of all the gold from West Africa.
These African kingdoms also expanded their wealth by raiding small, non-Muslim villages on their borders. Soldiers forced people to pay tribute and carried away others to sell or work as slaves.
The reason why middlemen in the Saharan trade didn't want anybody to know what was going on at either end of their trade routes was because they feared competition, in particular from perhaps a more heavily armed ruler of some state who decided to go and monopolize the sources of the gold for themselves.
Throughout the Middle Ages, the Islamic world had been more technologically advanced than Europe.
Examples that leap to mind have to do with their architecture, their navigation, their observations of astronomical data, and so forth. A lot of European science actually winds up deriving great benefit from the Muslim world once they start to make contact by the late Middle Ages.
In the early 15th century, Europe was just recovering from a wave of epidemic diseases that had ravaged the continent for more than a century. Most Europeans were agricultural peasants, poor and often malnourished. Unlike Africa and the Americas, where women played prominent roles, men dominated all aspects of life in Europe. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had been the central institution in Europe. It not only controlled religious life, but played a major role in the political, economic, and cultural life of Europe as well. But in the 15th century, the power of the Church was eroding. Cities were growing, and centralized states like France and Spain were becoming stronger. Commerce was expanding, and merchants were getting rich. As the feudal system broke down, large estates were broken up into smaller plots which could be bought and sold as private property. The Bible taught European Christians that man had dominion over the earth. And as people worked to improve their lives, they saw the land, forests, rivers, and animals as resources to exploit for private gain. Economic growth, coupled with the new ideas unleashed by a renaissance in the sciences and the arts, were revolutionizing Europe. More and more people were coming to believe that mysteries could be understood and problems solved by thinking about them rationally. This attitude supported scientific inquiry and led to a number of important inventions and technological innovations.
The printing press was one possible way for people to know more, not that anybody printed much of anything in the early years except the Bible, but new kinds of ships and new navigation equipment that made it possible to go farther from home.
Meanwhile, Christian armies were gaining ground in their long war against the Muslims who had ruled Spain for 700 years. And Christian soldiers fighting religious wars to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims were bringing back to Europe exotic new plants, spices, fabrics, jewels, and other treasures that Europeans wanted more of.
Europeans had to trade with Islamic traders because everything that the Europeans wanted, like gold and ivory and eventually slaves, were on the other side of the Islamic frontier. So whether they were importing spices from the east or gold from West Africa, they had to go through Islamic middlemen.
Many began to wonder, was there a water route that would give them direct access to the Indies?
So one of the interests Europeans had, and when they developed the technology to do so, they began to think of finding another way to what they called the Orient, the spice trade, the gold and the silver that would make them rich.
In Portugal, a small and isolated nation on the far western edge of Europe, Prince Henry the Navigator thought that by sailing south along the coast of Africa, he could open new trade routes to Black Africa and the Indies.
Henry the Navigator was the prince of the ocean, and he gathered around him scientists, he gathered around him map makers, he gathered around him sailors. He started a school of navigation.
Prince Henry sponsored a series of expeditions down the west coast of Africa. By the 1470s, the Portuguese had reached the Niger River Delta and the city-states of Benin, where the king gave them permission to trade for gold, ivory, and slaves. Each year they sailed further south, setting up trading posts along the way. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama finally reached India. The water route to Asia was a reality. But the African continent was much bigger than Prince Henry had thought, and any voyages to India would take a long time. Might there be a shorter route to the Indies? European scientists knew that the world was round and had made fairly accurate estimates of its size. Japan, they guessed correctly, was some 11,000 miles to the west. Many ships had explored the Atlantic, finding the Madeira and Azore Islands. But what lay beyond remained a mystery. Mariners' stories of monstrous creatures and unsolved disappearances offered little encouragement for long voyages into the unknown. But there were tales of land beyond the Atlantic. According to an old Viking legend, in the year 1000, Leif Erikson had sailed west from a Viking village on Greenland and come to a flat land covered with trees, which the Vikings called Vinland. Archaeologists confirmed the story in the 1960s when they uncovered the remains of a Viking encampment in Newfoundland, Canada. But 11th century Europeans had no need for cold, distant lands inhabited by hostile peoples. After 4 or 5 attempts to build settlements in Vinland, the Vikings left and did not return.
But the significant thing about Leif Erikson is that he's lost to history and had very little effect on subsequent colonization.
By the late 15th century, the situation was very different. Backed by growing economies, new technologies, and a lust for riches, Europeans were willing to take some chances. Onto this scene stepped Cristobal Colon, who we know as Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus was a man from Genoa, a seagoing man, a very experienced ship captain, but he only knew a very limited part of the world.
Convinced that the Earth was smaller than most scientists said, and that the Indies lay only 3,000 miles to the west, Columbus wanted the King of Portugal to bankroll him for a voyage across the Atlantic. The king had no interest in such harebrained schemes. But King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain liked Columbus's plan, for it offered them a way to beat the Portuguese to Asia. The king and queen were also devout Catholics, and they were impressed by Columbus's deep faith and his promise to convert to Catholicism any heathens he found in the Indies.
One went out in order to spread the greater glory of the church, which was also linked to the greater glory and one hope to the profit of the state. So they gave Columbus enough support so that he could have the 3 ships that sent him off into the western waters, and of course eventually he touched down in Hispaniola, which is part of the Caribbean, and discovered, quote, the New World, even though he never knew he discovered it.
October 12th, 1492. 3 small ships appeared in the morning light off an island its inhabitants called Guanahani, somewhere in the Bahamas. Soon, strange men with white faces and bodies encased in some unknown covering and shiny shells around their chests rowed to shore. The Arawaks, being a curious and peaceful people, showed up to greet them. Unacquainted with steel, some of them cut their hands, grasping the Spaniards' swords. An exchange of food and water to drink for some beads and trinkets seemed to cement a promising friendship.
He hit these islands. He convinced himself that he had achieved what God had said he would achieve. He would find this route. And thus he dubbed the natives Indians, for example, and he acted as if he was in the outer reaches of what today we'd call Japan, and then with a little more effort he would find what today we call China.
Indians is a wrong term to describe Native Americans. Indians are people that are indigenous to India, and they think that Columbus discovered us, but we weren't discovered. We knew who we were, and we had a flourishing culture way before they ever set their foot on the New World.
Looking for gold, Columbus sailed on to Cuba and Hispaniola and claimed them as well. The native people were curious, friendly, and generous, but they had very little gold. Still, the King and Queen of Spain were delighted with Columbus's voyage and agreed to sponsor more expeditions. This time, Columbus promised to find the Emperor of China and bring back gold, spices, and slaves. But he didn't find the Emperor on his next voyage or the next one after that. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas, visiting many islands and the coasts of Central and South America. He died still believing he had found Asia. But the European explorers who followed him soon realized that Columbus had stumbled upon a vast and exotic new world of incredible wealth and beauty. Separated by 2 great oceans, the old and new worlds developed very different ecosystems of plants, animals, and microbes. Columbus's discovery of the Americas brought these continents back into contact and initiated a biological exchange between Africa, Europe, and the Americas that would rewrite this history of the world. Bringing previously isolated ecosystems together is much like lighting a match near an open can of gasoline. The Columbian Exchange had a lethal impact on New World people, plants, and animals, for the Old World had a distinct advantage in domesticated animals, weeds, pests, and almost everything else. European and African organisms swept across huge expanses of the Americas, quickly muscling out native plants and animals. European grasses, weeds, and rats spread like wildfire.
The discovery of the New World changed 2 worlds, changed the New World and the Old World. When we think of those amber waves of grain out there, those amber waves of grain were brought over by Europeans. They wanted to grow oats and barley and wheat and rye, and they brought those crops over, and here in this virgin land, those crops flourished. The swine flourished. They grew by the tens and thousands. The cattle flourished, and some of them went wild. You get your longhorns in Texas and other places. And the horses, some of those escaped, which has changed the plains culture of Indians. Instead of having to walk, you could have a horse, and they could cover wide areas. When I said fundamental change, I mean it. It literally remade both continents.
One of the most important kinds of contact, and was entirely unexpected, was the effect that European diseases had on these native peoples.
While the Americas were comparatively disease-free, Europe and Africa were loaded with them, and the age of Columbus was the age of infectious disease in Europe, an era ushered in by the Black Death of the 14th century. Exposed to infectious diseases for many centuries, Europeans and Africans had developed immunities that Native Americans lacked.
In time, they understood that the viruses that they were getting, deadly viruses, smallpox, diphtheria, things of that sort, they realized they were getting them from the Europeans, but there was no stopping it. There were no remedies. Whole tribes could be wiped out. It led to a huge depopulation of the Americas, so that for several centuries the population of the Americas kept going down and down and down as more and more Europeans arrived.
Using the growing colony of Hispaniola as a base, Spanish conquistadors, or conquerors, spread out through the Americas. They sailed north to Florida. They crossed Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean. They conquered the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. In search of the 7 cities of gold, they wandered deep into North America and sailed up the coast of California. And everywhere they went, disease either preceded or followed them. In 1519, Hernando Cortés led an army into the heart of Mexico. The Aztec Empire the Spaniards found there was large and powerful, and its capital city, Tenochtitlan, astonished the Spaniards.
I mean, some of these soldiers had actually fought in other wars that had taken them as far as Constantinople and certainly been to Rome, but they were unprepared for a city of that size and grandeur anywhere in the Americas.
At first, the Aztec leader Montezuma welcomed Cortés and his men. But after Spanish soldiers attacked worshippers at a religious ceremony, the Aztecs fought back. Though they vastly outnumbered the Spaniards, the Aztecs' weapons were no match for the armor, guns, cannons, and mastiffs of the conquistadors. The Spanish fought the Aztecs for more than a year, aided by other Mexican tribes eager to escape the cruelty and human sacrifice practiced by their Aztec rulers. But Cortés had another, more powerful ally: disease. Smallpox spread rapidly through central Mexico, the most densely populated region in the Americas. In less than 100 years, the population plunged from perhaps 25 million people down to a little more than 1 million.
The Europeans, in carrying these diseases, and they didn't understand what was happening, but in carrying these diseases and seeing that somehow people are dying before them, were reinforced in their own idea of mission, that God has said, go forth and conquer this land. They carried with them as well this crusading idea that God expected them to go out and convert the heathen, and if not to convert them, at least to destroy them, so that they wouldn't stink in God's nostrils, to use a Christian phrase of the day.
Who can deny, wrote Oviedo, that the use of gunpowder against pagans is the burning of incense to our Lord? So many Native Americans died from cruel treatment, overwork, and disease that few people were left to harvest the riches of the Americas for the Spanish crown.
There simply wasn't enough population to work the new land, which was there in huge abundance. Consequently, they needed new population sources.
The Spaniards found the solution to their labor problem in West African slaves, who, because they came from environments similar to those of the Americas, had a greater resistance than Europeans and Indians to most contagious diseases.
They went for that huge reservoir of labor in Africa. It was available. There were Africans there who were willing to sell people from different tribes, and it started one of the most brutal, dehumanizing commerce in the world. This dealing in human flesh. We look back on it now, we wonder how it could have happened. So many millions of people enslaved and brutalized and brought to the New World.
By the 1520s, the Spaniards had also discovered that the American tropics were an ideal climate for the growing of the substance that Europeans craved more than anything else: sugar.
In some cases, and this is one of the ironies, the kinds of skills that Africans had of being able to work crops in a semi-tropical environment actually increased the rationale for enslaving those people rather than somebody else.
It was the New World sugar plantations, then, that fueled the greatest forced migration in modern world history. Over the next 400 years, close to 12 million West Africans were loaded onto slave ships for the Americas. Millions more died before they reached the boats. The trade in black gold wreaked havoc on Africa, disorienting and disrupting African societies and economies. In addition to the loss of millions, the trade in slaves led to the emergence of great slave-trading kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti, which waged war to capture men and women for sale to the Europeans.
Black gold came about as a a new name for African slave labor. And they were called black gold because they were as valuable as gold, and in fact they came from the same region.
The majority of slaves exported from Africa were sent across the Atlantic Ocean, where they wound up on plantations in either Brazil or in the Caribbean.
In the following centuries, the interbreeding of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans in the New World brought about the greatest mixing of the races in world history. In the Americas, Africans struggled to adapt to life under slavery. Torn from their homes in Africa, they tried to preserve their languages, religions, customs, and traditions. Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans all borrowed from each other, creating new cultures in the Americas. European cultivation of corn and potatoes would fuel an explosion in European population, contributing to the rapid growth in Europe's population after 1650, followed by increasing European migration to the Americas. The cassava, a root plant of South American origin, would provide calories for multitudes of Africans and Asians in areas previously too wet, too dry, or too infertile to support more than sparse populations. Spain's American Empire helped make it the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Soon, other European countries, Portugal, France, England, Sweden, Holland, began sending ships across the ocean to find riches of their own in America and to find a route around the continent to Asia. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, John Cabot landed in North America, probably in Newfoundland, and claimed the land for the King of England. 3 years later, Portuguese sea captain Pedro Álvares Cabral landed on the coast of Brazil, which would become an important Portuguese colony. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed to what is now Canada and claimed that land for France.
The biggest difference technologically between Native Americans, West Africans, and Europeans was that neither Native Americans nor West Africans could traverse large bodies of water, whereas Europeans could, and that's why Europeans came to them.
During the next century, settlers from nearly every country found their way across the Atlantic. The nations of Western Europe engaged in a fierce competition for the land and resources of the New World. After 1517, this competition among Europeans divided them by religion as well as nationality. It was in that year that German monk Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses onto the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg and unleashed the Protestant Reformation. This split between European Christians set off a century of devastating warfare. Catholics and Protestants carried their religious wars across the Atlantic, battling each other for the gold, territory, and the souls of Native Americans. European settlers, the Native American peoples they encountered, and the African slaves they brought with them would all make their mark on the New World and on each other. Their interactions in North America would shape a new colonial society unlike any the world had ever seen before.